Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we have a great program for you this evening, featuring journalist turned documentary filmmaker and author, Chris Whipple, who's here to talk about his new book, The Fight of His Life, Inside Joe Biden's White House. Chris's early work was in journalism, first with Foreign Policy magazine and then as a correspondent with Life magazine. He moved into broadcast news, where he garnered awards as a producer at CBS's 60 Minutes and ABC's Prime Time. He next ventured into documentary film, setting up a production company just over a decade ago. He's also been writing books. 6 years ago, he came out with The Gatekeepers, which examined the role of White House chiefs of staff in defining the presidencies in which they serve. 2.5 years ago, in The Spy Masters, Chris looked at another group of highly influential Washington officials, those who've led the Central Intelligence Agency, and how they've shaped the agency and world events. In The Fight of His Life, Chris provides an inside account of Biden's first 2 years as president. As he says in an author's note, writing about an administration in real time had challenges he hadn't faced in his previous books. One very significant challenge was persuading sources to talk, because unlike the subjects of Chris's earlier books, who were looking back from the comfort of very often of retirement, those in the Biden administration Chris reached out to were still in the middle of the action and were in some cases somewhat reluctant to speak frankly or depart from the official line. Still, Chris, to his credit, managed to carry on revealing conversations with a number of the most senior officials around President Biden. And his book is the first substantive look inside an administration that has been remarkably disciplined so far about keeping its internal deliberations confidential and out of the media. Plus, the book is quite a fair-minded account. Kirkus, in a review, called Chris a reliable, readable interpreter, and Publishers Weekly commends The Fight of His Life as a balanced assessment of the administration's successes and failures. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Chris Whipple.
Thank you, Bradley, for that great introduction. I love Politics and Prose, and it is wonderful to be here and to see this turnout. When I came here for the first time, I was telling Brad. Is the microphone on? Test? 1, 2, 3. I got to get closer. Okay. You would think I would have this down by now. My first time here back, I was reminding Brad, was 2017 when I had the privilege, the honor of being interviewed here by Peter Baker of the New York Times and Ken Duberstein, Ronald Reagan's last chief of staff, the late Ken Duberstein, who became a very good friend of mine. And that was a real honor. But tonight beats that, I got to say, because we have two former White House chiefs of staff here in attendance. The great Jim Jones, sitting right here, was Lyndon Johnson's chief of staff in 1968 at the age of 28. He said he felt like he was 50. And we have another chief of staff here, again, a great friend of mine, and who's taught me everything I know about this subject, the great Mac McLarty, Bill Clinton's first chief of staff. So anyway, what an honor. It's too bad that it's been such a slow news month for the Biden White House and its chiefs of staff, and so I don't know what we'll talk about. But yesterday, Bradley was kind enough to quote a couple of reviews. Yesterday, a review of The Fight of His Life appeared in the print edition of the New York Times book review. The reviewer, John Gans, was really generous. I thought he called it a Herculean effort and a second draft of history, but it wasn't all hosannas. He also suggested that the story of Biden's White House might lack the excitement of Trump's White House, that compared to that 18-car pileup, this administration is a fender bender. Well, right after that review went online, I got an email from Ron Klain. It read, "Sorry we weren't saucier." But so let me just say, respectfully, that both Gans and Klain are wrong, in my opinion. The truth is that there's plenty of drama to this White House, especially behind closed doors. People have asked me why I wrote the book, and my answer is, how could I not? Joe Biden and his team came into office facing the most daunting challenges since FDR's presidency: a once-in-a-century pandemic, a crippled economy, global warming, racial injustice, and the aftermath of a bloody assault on the U.S. Capitol. All that before a Russian tyrant invaded a democracy in the heart of Europe. How could anyone with a political or storytelling bone in his body not want to tell that story, especially if you could tell it from the inside with access to Joe Biden's inner circle? As Brad pointed out, my first two books, The Gatekeepers about White House chiefs and The Spy Masters about CIA directors, covered more than 100 years of history between them, and yet this was more challenging. Writing a book about a sitting White House is like designing an airplane in mid-flight. You're getting buffeted by events in real time, knocked off course by a COVID variant here, an invasion of Ukraine there. You have no idea where you're going, and you just hope to land the plane in one piece. Compounding that difficulty is that this is the most battened down, disciplined, leak-proof, on-message White House that I can remember. Joe Biden's advisors don't give many interviews, much less speak out of school. Yet I was fortunate to spend 2 years talking with almost every member of Joe Biden's inner circle and got many of them to go off script. And I was able to put questions to the president and vice president as well. It probably didn't hurt that I was having regular talks with the chief of staff, Ron Klain. We had a running 2-year conversation that gave me a front row seat to recent history. I really see the fight of his life in the Biden presidency as a political thriller in 3 acts. The first act was the unbelievably fraught transition from Trump to Biden, the most contentious and, as it turned out, the bloodiest since the Civil War. It's the almost unbelievable, previously untold story of how an obscure Trump White House official, a deputy White House chief of staff, carried out a sub rosa operation under Trump's nose and without his knowledge. This official kept the wheels of the transition turning. He thought about resigning many times, but his friends talked him off the ledge, telling him, "You can't quit. If you do, who will ensure that there's a peaceful transfer of power?" The second act was the first year of Biden's presidency, which was overshadowed by the botched evacuation from Afghanistan. One of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's favorite expressions he stole from Mike Tyson, and it goes, "Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth." Well, Biden and his team got punched in the mouth by the sudden, unexpected collapse of the Afghan regime, which resulted in a panicked evacuation and a steady decline in Joe Biden's approval rating. While they maintained a united front in public, there was plenty of disagreement among Biden's inner circle behind the scenes, as I discovered. Tony Blinken told me, the Secretary of State, that everything they did was based on a fatally flawed intelligence estimate that the Afghan government would last for 18 months. But this was news to CIA Director Bill Burns when I sat down with him at CIA headquarters in his 7th floor office. He told me that the CIA had been clear-eyed about the fragility of the Afghan regime, that if you remove 2 legs of the stool, namely the U.S. military and American contractors, it was a recipe for a quick collapse. In the end, Joe Biden and his team thought they had more time. It was, in my judgment, a whole of government failure. Everyone did almost everything wrong. And thus began a long slide in Biden's approval rating. A new COVID variant known as Delta erupted, inflation shot upward, and supply-side problems struck. For months on end, Biden's legislative agenda sputtered. You know, in late October 2021, I went to visit Ron Klain at the White House. It was, I think, really the low point of the Biden presidency. Biden had just left for Europe and the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, with nothing to show for all his efforts to pass the Build Back Better and bipartisan infrastructure bills. Biden had even mused aloud on camera that the fate of his presidency depended on passing those bills, and they were dead in the water. Sitting on the patio of his West Wing office, Klain confessed to me that he was considering quitting. But after talking it over with his wife, he decided to stay. He had a compelling reason not to quit just yet, but I'm not going to give you that spoiler. The third act of this political thriller began on February 24, 2022, when Vladimir Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine. This, in my view, was the turning point of the Biden presidency. And in contrast to the Afghan evacuation, this time, everyone did almost everything right. Joe Biden was uniquely qualified to rally NATO and the Western world in defiance of Vladimir Putin and defense of Ukraine. He'd spent his career preparing for this moment, and more than any of his predecessors, he had no illusions about Vladimir Putin. When he looked into the Russian dictator's eyes, he saw no soul. In the walk-up to the invasion, Biden's National Security Council and State Department performed brilliantly, and it was also the CIA's finest hour, comparable to its remarkable performance in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. U.S. intelligence had Vladimir Putin dead to rights. They knew exactly what he was up to, and CIA Director Bill Burns paid a secret visit to Zelensky and shared the blueprint of the Russian invasion. So whose idea was it to weaponize intelligence about Russian disinformation in order to keep Putin off balance? You can read about that in the book. Behind closed doors, Biden and Tony Blinken and Sullivan braced Western allies for the invasion to come. But the whole enterprise was touch and go. NATO leaders weren't buying it. And even Volodymyr Zelensky was unconvinced. One of the previously untold stories that I report is of Kamala Harris meeting privately with Zelensky on the eve of the invasion at the Munich Security Conference. She told Ukraine's leader, not only were the Russians coming for Ukraine, they were coming for him and his family. Zelensky was still unconvinced, and as he left, the vice president turned to an aide and said, "I wonder if that's the last time we'll see him alive." The president's relationship with Kamala Harris is fascinating and complicated. We can talk more about that later, if you like. But in fact, my favorite parts of the book are not so much the policy, as interesting as that is, watching it being debated behind closed doors. I think my favorite parts are the glimpses of Biden in his private, unguarded moments. It's what he really thinks of the vice president and his Secret Service detail, and about living in the White House, and about the press corps. It's the chip he carries on his shoulder regarding people who didn't take him seriously, like the patrician Averell Harriman, FDR's friend and gatekeeper to the Washington establishment, who once doubted young Senator Joe Biden's command of foreign affairs. 5 decades later, Biden can barely remember Harriman's name, but still rails against that rich guy, the railroad guy. And Biden has not forgiven a couple of guys named Axelrod and Pluff either, who doubted he was presidential material. A friend of Biden's told me he hates the Davids. The truth is that Joe Biden has been underestimated time and time and time again in his political career. The president's successful rallying of NATO against Putin was followed by a string of bipartisan legislative victories, culminating in the landmark Inflation Reduction Act. The story of how that came about is a good one, by the way, and it was portrayed as a kind of freelance deal between Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer But let me tell you, the White House was in it every step of the way, and Ron Klain knew exactly what he was doing. Anyway, it's a legislative record that rivals LBJ's. Maybe Jim would disagree. And achieved with a razor-thin Democratic majority. And yet, as the midterm elections of November 2022 approached, the experts said that Biden and his party would be routed by the GOP. They predicted a loss of 40 or more seats in the House. Well, we know how that turned out, and it was due in no small part to Ron Klain. The president wanted to campaign nearly everywhere and brag about his first-term accomplishments. Klain, as chief of staffs will do, sat the boss down and advised him to go only to states where he could make a difference and talk about women's reproductive rights and the threat posed by the MAGA movement to democracy. At 1:16 a.m. on election night, Klain sent me an email, unsolicited, that summed up his reaction to the results. It read, "Maybe we don't suck as much as people thought." It was one of those great unscripted moments, that every reporter lives for. Earlier that same day, Politico had reported that it was time for Klain to go, that he bore responsibility for the inevitable GOP shellacking to come. But it was Klain's patient nose-to-the-grindstone stewardship that ultimately proved the experts wrong. As I wrote in a recent New York Times op-ed essay, excuse me, Klain had a rare skill set, one that Mac McLarty and Jim Jones share. White House experience, knowledge of Capitol Hill, political savvy, managerial acumen, and a long working relationship with the president. And one other thing, which all great chiefs of staff, the James Bakers and the Leon Panettas share, and that is a first-class temperament. Klain never got too high when things were going well or too low when disaster struck, and he managed down as well as up, treating the White House staff with respect. In his letter praising him the other day, Joe Biden noted that Klain had not only great abilities, but, quote, a big heart, end quote. No wonder the Biden White House has been practically leak-proof and conflict-free. But as I also noted in my op-ed piece, now comes the hard part. Joe Biden is almost certainly running for re-election. Why do I think so? All of his inner circle are convinced he's running. And Andy Card, George W. Bush's first chief of staff, told me something that rings true. He said, "Chris, if anybody ever tells you they're leaving the White House voluntarily, they're probably lying to you." Who was the last president to do so, after all? Was Lyndon Johnson in 1968. An octogenarian, Biden must navigate the uncharted waters of a bruising re-election campaign with a special counsel investigating him and a hostile Republican-controlled House hell-bent on sinking him. And he must do so with a new, untested chief of staff. Jeff Zients, Klain's replacement, will have large shoes to fill. But Zients is no slouch. Since his days in Barack Obama's administration, he's been regarded as a genius at making government work. After he fixed the botched website for the Affordable Care Act, Biden started calling him a BFD, for big blanking deal, after the vice president's famous off-mic remark. Zients also shares Klain's cool temperament under fire. Still, he has weaknesses that could spell trouble. Headed into a re-election campaign, Zients lacks Klain's deep political savvy. This could lead Biden to rely on other aides, Stephen Ricchetti, Anita Dunn, and Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, who are all talented, for advice, while his chief tends to the day-to-day running of the West Wing. But that would be a mistake, as the late Ken Duberstein would be the first to tell you. To govern effectively, every president needs an empowered chief of staff who is first among equals. That person doesn't have to have strong political views like Klain, but he or she must have strong instincts. Zients also can't match Klain's 3-decade bond with his boss, which enabled him to tell the president hard truths. It's a little difficult to imagine Zients second-guessing Joe Biden's stubborn political instincts, but that's what chiefs are paid to do. And science, finally on this subject, must also look out for what Bill Clinton's chief, Mac McLarty, famously calls UFOs, unforeseen occurrences. So what about Joe Biden's age? Let's talk about that. How old is too old to run for re-election? Andy Card told me he favors a constitutional amendment that would prohibit anyone from running for president beyond the age of 75. I'm 75, he said, and I'm not as sharp as I used to be. But there's another way of looking at it. Jack Watson, Jimmy Carter's final chief, argues that aging is a very individual thing. It affects everyone differently. Many Supreme Court justices, John Marshall, Felix Frankfurter, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, were firing on every cylinder well into their 80s. Pablo Picasso had his most productive period before he died at 91. Last time I checked, Warren Buffett is doing just fine, well into his 90s. So, Watson concludes, let the voters decide. You could say that Joe Biden's whole life, and I'm going to want to get to questions in a minute, and I'll shut up and we'll have a discussion. But you could say that Joe Biden's whole life has been a fight against tragedy, adversity, and bad luck. He lost his wife and infant daughter in a car crash, his son Beau to a brain tumor, 2 campaigns for the presidential nomination. His father always told him to get up, and so Joe did, winning the presidency at last. Entering his third year, his to-do list is daunting. He must fend off a hostile Republican majority in the House, with 2020 election deniers on key committees. The president and his new chief, I think, should take a page from Mr. Clinton's playbook. Speaker Newt Gingrich and his Republican caucus pursued a scorched earth political strategy, impeaching Clinton over his affair with Monica Lewinsky, but the 42nd president mostly ignored them and focused on governing. Biden must also implement the legislative accomplishments of his first 2 years because those won't really count until the rubber meets the road. And he has plenty of other battles to fight against a possible recession, against the continuing threat of MAGA, against his wounded but still dangerous nemesis, Donald Trump. But Putin's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, I believe, is the fight of Joe Biden's life. And the prospect of nuclear war is what keeps him up at night. A lot of people have compared him to FDR, but I think another comparison may be more apt. The historian William Manchester described the leader England needed as the Nazis overran Europe in 1940. He wrote, he would have to be a passionate Manichaean who saw the world as a medieval struggle to the death between the powers of good and the powers of evil. Now, at last, his hour had struck. He had been waiting for 40 years, had grown bald and gray in his nation's service, had endured slander and calumny, only to be summoned when the situation seemed hopeless. That man, of course, was Winston Churchill, but Manchester could have been describing Joe Biden. Both men had spent their careers in public service without ever grasping the brass ring. Both were mocked for their long-winded oratory. Yet Churchill was summoned when Hitler was poised to conquer Britain, and Joe Biden was summoned in 2020 when an authoritarian president refused to leave office peacefully. As it turned out, he was also the person best prepared to deal with a Russian tyrant who threatened not only Europe, but Western democracy. And now, Joe Biden's third year and fourth act begins. It's a political thriller with no ending yet. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions.
I just wonder. I've been around for a long time. I was born in the 1940s. If to be a great leader today, you have to be good on television. From JFK, maybe television wasn't Johnson's medium, but for sure Clinton, and for sure Obama, and Ronald Reagan. I thought he was a terrible president. and not a nice man. I was working at EPA at the time. I was in the deep state.
Yeah.
And my late husband was working at the EEOC, and that was even deeper. But he was a good actor. So he played a compassionate, optimistic president. If you told him to play some other kind of president, he would have been able to do that. Yeah. And the one thing that Biden lacks is charisma. He's not good on television. He doesn't speak well. It's just, I just wonder if in this day and age, somebody like that can succeed with the American people, or whether you have to have that, whatever it is.
Yeah. Well, look, it's a perfectly valid question, and I wouldn't argue with the premise that Joe Biden is no Ronald Reagan on camera, or Jack Kennedy,
or Obama.
However, I think Joe Biden would probably say, "Watch me." He won by 7 million votes in 2020, and he's arguably, the only known quantity who can beat Trump in 2024. I happen to think Trump may well be the nominee. I think in 2024, and I think the Biden White House is planning on it. And so I think he's had a remarkable run. The first year, that second act that I talked about, notwithstanding, with Afghanistan, he's passed, he's created more jobs than Reagan or anybody else in that period, 11 million jobs. He's brought COVID more or less under control. He's rallied the West to support NATO. So you can look at the record and argue that, well, depends on the alternative. Don't, as Biden likes to say, don't compare me to the almighty. Compare me to the alternative.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. I, as an old millennial and someone who supported Bernie Sanders 2 times and campaigned for him 2 times, and then voted for Biden because, well, I wasn't going to vote for Trump personally, I have to say that I have been pleasantly surprised in how Biden, who is definitely more to the center than my politics are, has been able to do what needs to be done in terms of recognizing the necessity of dealing with student loan debts and really speaking to the more progressive wing of the party. I was very surprised that he was able to do that. And I was wondering if you could speak at all as to how, I don't know if it's his people have gotten him to move, or has he seen just the reality on the ground and has just decided? Like, how did those changes happen?
Well, it's a great question, because I think a lot of us who've followed Joe Biden for years or decades think of him as that centrist, kind of blue collar, lunch pail Democrat, but not FDR. It's certainly not Bernie Sanders. I find your comments really interesting and fascinating, because I was in Dallas this week on last Monday talking to a bunch of really well-heeled Republicans. To my astonishment, the host had bought 120 copies of my book and gave them to all his friends, but he was a Trump, he was really to the right wing. And he asked me, he said, "Chris," he said, "it seems to me that Joe Biden's been governing from the left. Do you think he's going to continue to do that for the next 2 years?" And my answer was, I know a lot of progressives who would argue with that and say, you know what, he's disappointed us at every turn. I mean, look at all the planks in the Build Back Better bill that got thrown over the bus. So I'm encouraged that you feel that he has been attentive to progressives, because I think in many ways he's probably disappointed them.
Well, he's not Bernie Sanders, like you said. But what I will say is perhaps it's because the progressive wing has been speaking out more forcefully, and perhaps we've just made it so he has responded. But there have been symbolic things that he has done in terms of making good, in terms of appointing the first black woman onto the Supreme Court bench. Granted, it didn't change anything. It still leans conservative. But there are still those symbolic things that he nods to. And I think even people that are in the millennial to younger, you can't say that he's done nothing now in terms of speaking, like I said, to student loans, which is a huge issue.
Yeah. And I'm going to contradict what I just said because about disappointing progressives, because I think that if you scratch a little bit, you'll discover that Joe Biden is much more progressive than people think. We think of him as a centrist. He ran a very progressive campaign in 2020, and the whole notion of building the economy up and out, and it was a fairly radical transformation of the economy that he was talking about, and he tried like hell on voting rights. Hasn't gotten there yet.
And now on police reform.
He's certainly said a lot.
Saying the right things.
Yeah. Thanks.
And just to follow up, I wouldn't minimize the impact that the Bernie campaign had on pushing him to the left, but that isn't my question. I'm interested in process. I'm interested in your thoughts on why your sources opened up to you and had an ongoing conversation with you. And I'm very interested in your reflection on how you protect yourself from a bias to keep those sources talking to you.
Sure. No, they're good questions. The answer is, I don't know. To the first part, I'm not sure why they opened up to me, but I think it had something to do with my track record on my last two books. I think people felt they were fair, and the Gatekeepers in particular was right down the middle. I think Ron Klain appreciated that. I think getting Ron Klain's, if not his trust, because you should trust but verify in that job, but at least getting Ron Klain's cooperation opened a lot of doors for me. I think the fact that I was talking to Klain certainly made it easier for me with some of my other sources. And for whatever reason, they decided, well, we'd rather talk to this guy than not. So having said that, I wasn't easy. It was a war of attrition. I had to really go back and back and back. And furthermore, this may be inside baseball, but every interview I did with the White House was on deep background, quote unquote, which meant I had to return to each source and get approval for any attribution to them. Otherwise, it's a senior White House official. I could use blind quotes, but to attribute any of them, and that was a lot of work. But I kept my end of the bargain. So. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question was, how do you prevent getting spun? You just do your best, and I've been doing this for a long time, and I think I can detect it when people are just spinning me, and I just try to be fair and accurate.
Thank you very much for your insightful and very excellent presentation. I read yesterday's New York Times, and that's why I'm here. I'm also a supporter of Biden. As much as I like the left agenda and I'm quite progressive, I don't think Bernie Sanders has the managerial skills that Biden has, and so I'm grateful for his leadership and would vote for him again. But I am going to be provocative, and it has to do with the Supreme Court, and it has to do with the Roe decision, which was during his watch. The worst moment I can think of for Joe Biden was in the testimony and proceedings to get Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. He failed us miserably. He did not let people come forward, and he just did all of that abysmally wrong. Have you heard the White House or him have the integrity to apologize for that huge mistake?
I didn't get a chance to ask him about that. And this is speculative, but just based on what I know about Joe Biden. My guess is that he regrets it.
I hope so.
I think he does regret it. I think politically it's asking a lot of him to come out and say so publicly. And quite frankly, I don't hear the Washington Press Corps ask him about it ever. Yeah. So, but if you were to ask him, I think he might be honest. I think he might say, you know what, I could have done that better.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks for the great book and
Thank
the
you.
great discussion. So I really enjoyed the first part of the book that had to do with Chris Liddell and the transition. And I was curious because there was a mention that maybe the hectic transition going into the Bush administration may have led partially to bad intelligence or late intelligence that led into 9/11.
Right.
Out of curiosity, do you think that Afghanistan would have happened regardless of how early those presidential daily briefings started and the transition happened? Or do you think that truly was just that delay led to kind of what we saw on America's exit from Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think that the transition affected their planning for a lot of things, and Afghanistan included. COVID probably even more. They couldn't get any accurate numbers on COVID. They couldn't. That's another story. With Afghanistan, among other things, in 2020, March of 2020, Donald Trump, his administration, shut down the visa program. The whole process of approving people to be evacuated out of the country was shut down. That didn't help, and they never got it up to speed sufficiently to deal with the numbers of people who needed to get out. Having said so, it affected them. But I think at the end of the day that Biden and his team made plenty of mistakes. But when Donald Trump said that we're going to get out by May 1st, when he set that deadline and that half-baked negotiation he did with the Taliban that was really full of holes, but when he set that deadline of May 1st, from that moment forward, I think the Afghan government knew that we were going to hit the road. We were done, and they hit the road first. I think I think it was mission impossible, probably, for them to have done it much. They could have done a better job. They had too few troops on the ground. They thought they had more time. They should have known they didn't. But I think the die was cast by Trump.
Great, thanks.
Why is it so difficult to figure out a role for the vice president vis-a-vis the White House staff, with only the possible exception of Bill Clinton and Al Gore?
Yeah, I should just give the mic to Mac right now.
Just say to everybody, this is her or his issue, and you guys stay out of that.
Well, there's the right way to empower the vice president, and that would be Mac's administration, and there's a wrong way, which would be Jim's. Hubert Humphrey would be the first to tell you that. But, interestingly, in the book, I talk about how Ron Klain sat down with Kamala Harris and said, okay, I've got 5 models for you. You choose the one you want to work with. There was the Dick Cheney model was ruled out. You can't have that. But you can have the Al Gore model. You can have the Walter Mondale model. You can try all the others. And she chose the Barack Obama Joe Biden model. It hasn't quite worked out that way. I mean, Kamala Harris is another long subject for discussion, but I don't know why she's had such difficulty stepping into that role. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. As Mac and Jim could tell you better than I. But when I ask people about Kamala Harris, almost universally they say, "What's she doing? Where is she?" And that's not because the White House has muzzled her. It's because, for whatever reason, maybe she felt burned early on when she took that trip to Guatemala and it was awkward and she took some criticism. Maybe she's just gun shy. But I know Ron Klain has told her repeatedly, you can't score runs from the dugout, and he's encouraged her to get out there and be higher profile, and she hasn't done it.
Thank you so much for your remarks today.
Sure.
I wanted to ask another question about the Supreme Court, which is intent on dismantling the administrative state. And I was wondering whether you had a sense of what actions, if any, the Biden administration might be taking to maintain a robust executive branch in lieu of the decisions we've already gotten and are sure to get that will take back the power away from the executive branch.
It's a good question, and I don't really have a very good answer for you because I think, I think that there's not very much that they can do except try to appoint better judges when the openings occur. And I don't think Joe Biden lies awake at night worrying about the court dismantling the administrative state. Steve Bannon tried that, and it didn't work so well. So I don't think it's at the top of his list of worries.
What do you think he learned as vice president that made him a better president today? I mean, he ran for president, a couple times, before being president in 2020. And also, who do you think he relies on the most for advice on Russia?
Let me take the second part first. I think probably CIA Director Bill Burns is the person he relies on most to deal with Putin. Nobody knows Putin outside of Putin's inner circle. Nobody knows him better than Bill Burns. And I do know, having spent some time with Bill Burns, that it's a scary prospect because Burns feels that conquering Ukraine is existential for Vladimir Putin. That doesn't mean that Putin will use a nuclear weapon in the process, but it does mean that it's really hard to imagine. I was talking to Burns in his office, and at one point he just posed the question out loud. He said, "Well, now he's in the eastern provinces. He's got those provinces. Maybe could he cut a deal?" And I said, "Do you really think he could? There could be a modus vivendi with Volodymyr Zelensky? Could he really live with Zelensky in power?" And Burns said, "No, I don't think so." He said he thought he would come back for the rest of Ukraine. I'm sorry. The first part of your question was, what did Joe Biden learn as vice president? I think he learned, just what a functioning president to vice president relationship is. I think that was a very productive relationship, and he never got, with that one exception of talking about recognizing gay marriage, he never got out over his skis with Obama, and so I think he also learned that he watched a bunch of chiefs of staff at work too, and I think that I think his choice of Ron Klain, as it's pretty obvious by now, was a great one.
All right, thank you. This has been great. You said that Trump may well be the nominee, and that the Biden White House is planning on it. Do they want Trump to be the nominee, on the theory that he might be the easiest to beat?
I wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
I think they're planning for him just because it's prudent to plan for the worst. I think that the one thing has surprised Joe Biden more than anything else during his presidency has been the lasting power of Trumpism. He thought it would be in the rearview mirror well before now. That Ron Klain told me that. That's the one thing that he just can't wrap his head around it. He won by 7 million votes. He thought he had a mandate. He thought it would pass. It hasn't. Biden gets that now. That's why you've seen him speak so forcefully about the MAGA movement. And I think he feels that democracy is still on the ballot, 2024.
All right, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I do want to ask about a policy issue, and this is the other third rail of American politics, and that's migration and the border and refugees and parolees and asylees and all the rest that fit into a lot of the different topics you've been talking about, because I've worked in that area for a long time. what was the process going on in the White House? And certainly there's many who would say that this is a problem a lot of political people don't want to solve because it's such a useful battering ram for the others.
Yep.
But Biden did come up with this idea of essentially the welcome core, and he's kind of redesigning the whole refugee asylee border process. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how they got there, and whether what's going to happen.
Well,
next.
I can tell that you know a lot more about this whole subject than I do, but so I probably couldn't get in the weeds with you about it. But just in general, I think, as you know, Joe Biden proposed a comprehensive immigration reform policy on day one, his first day. One of the problems here is that the Republicans, most of them, have no interest in solving the border. They want to use it as a cudgel, as you said. They want to. It's politically potent, and they want to use it as a club with which to beat Joe Biden and Democrats. So that, and it's, as I describe in the book, it's the one thing that really drives Biden crazy. He drops the F-bomb, and apologizes to women who wander in when he's doing that. He knows it's almost mission impossible right now, and there just aren't any good options. And as Ron Klain put it to me, almost everything you do will piss off either one faction or another, the progressives or the conservatives. We arrest a lot of people on the border. The progressives hate us. We don't. It's a problem. But it's the perfect example of what Rahm Emanuel used to say about the presidency. If it's easy, somebody else will solve it. Everything that gets into the Oval is between bad and worse. And that's immigration.
Hello there.
Yeah.
So I know that Afghanistan and Ukraine has taken a lot of the oxygen out of the room, but I'm wondering, what about the issues of other national security concerns such as Iran, North Korea, China? What else can you discuss? What he's discussed on that?
Not in great detail, because my time with Tony Blinken and others was really consumed with Ukraine, to be honest, with Ukraine and Afghanistan. But North Korea is a huge problem, and I know they're spending a lot of time on it. Iran is a problem, and as you know, for a long time they tried to revive the JCPOA. That's clearly dead now. The nuclear deal with Iran. Iran seems to be closer and closer every day to being able to. All I can tell you is, and they're trying to manage those problems, and China, and this is, I would say, and certainly I was lucky to having done the Spy Masters book, and the Gatekeepers. I got to know a lot of really knowledgeable national security officials, former officials, and most of them say that this is one of the most talented, experienced foreign policy teams they've ever seen. Certainly, Jim Stavridis believes that, and it's kind of like the best and the brightest. This is a really good bunch of people, and that's why, of course, Afghanistan was so surprising. I'm sorry I can't answer it in better detail.
Hi there. Thank you for your talk.
Sure.
After watching Build Back Better for a year, getting whittled down and torn apart, go out of existence, miraculously come back into existence, it was kind of astounding to me that a part of it that survived rather intact was the $369 billion for climate change. Do you have any insight on why something that doesn't seem to be as obvious or big a political winner as, say, universal pre-K or paid family leave survived when the biggest opponent of the bill came from a coal state and has the most money in Congress from fossil fuel interests?
Well, the answer, Joe Manchin essentially wrote the bill. What it came down to, although it wasn't quite the freelance operation that just came out of the blue between Schumer and Manchin. Ron Klain and the White House were involved in every detail on that. But basically what they figured out was we cannot present something to Manchin. It's got to be, for political reasons, he has to be the author of this because he will not, it's political death for him in West Virginia if he's seen helping Biden in any way. So they had to make it look like it was Manchin's bill. But Manchin had a lot of influence and he did preserve this shale operation, this pipeline in West Virginia. That was enough, apparently, for him to go along with all the good climate reform in that bill. But all the other progressive stuff got thrown under the bus, as you know, and that's largely because they decided this is going to be Manchin's bill.
It's a two-part question. What's your writing process like? Like, how do you balance the research and the writing? And is it iterative or is it one after the other? And if you had unlimited access, what's the book you'd want to write?
If I had unlimited access?
Yeah.
Well, the second part first. I think if I had unlimited access, I'd do the sequel, which is the next 2 years, and I'd use it. It's funny. A friend of mine at the CIA used to say, "Has anybody ever told you that you do this stuff backwards? Most people write the book and then do the film. You do the film and then write the book, which is what I did on my first two books. They began as documentary films, and then I decided this subject is so rich that it has to be a book. So that's how that happened. This one's different, obviously. This one is a book, and it's, as I say, the most challenging thing I've ever done. I was reporting it and writing it simultaneously every day, and I'm a morning person, so I'm up at 5 a.m. and I do my best writing between 5 a.m. and noon, and then take a little break, and then, at the end of the day, I'll have a cocktail and I'll edit everything I've written. That's the process. My wife, Carrie, who couldn't be with me tonight, is a huge part of it. She does so much of the work. She transcribes all the interviews. She does all the research. She fact checks. She's the photo editor. She does all that stuff. So that's a huge help. We're a team. I used to be a pretty slow writer. Not so much anymore. I'm pretty fast now, and there's nothing like a deadline to concentrate the mind when you're doing the first 2 years in progress.
Just two questions. I'd like to know President Biden's thought about Justice Department, Merrick Garland, and the second part, what's going to happen to the John Lewis Voter Right Act. I grew up in Tennessee. I'm California now, and I can tell you, I see where we're headed, and my friends and I, who are grassroots activists, it's going to be hard to get a lot of people out. They're going to go to the polls, but it's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
So
the answer to the first question is, you have to wonder, and I don't know the answer to this question. Nobody does, except maybe Dr. Jill Biden. But you have to wonder what Joe Biden thinks about how Merrick Garland is pursuing Trump. You have to wonder whether he thinks that Merrick Garland has been too cautious, or, but none of us knows except possibly Jill Biden, I would say, on that subject. The stakes are huge. I think that no matter how many times people say that a decision to prosecute Trump will be about the facts and the law alone, that's just not reality. It's a huge political decision. And I frankly think that I'm digressing now, but I think the documents flap with Joe Biden. I don't want to call it a scandal. Trump's handling is a scandal. Biden's is a flap. But I think it takes, it's hard to imagine prosecuting Trump for the Mar-a-Lago documents in light of, Merrick Garland has to be thinking, it seems to me, about what a jury will think, because that's just the real world. What a jury will think. Will they find Trump's handling of documents all that egregious when they keep popping up every other day in Joe Biden's houses? I think that's, and Mike Pence and others. So I just think that's a reality. On the second part of was the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I just think it's going to be even more difficult now with the first 2 years, the Democrats had a razor thin majority, couldn't get it done, couldn't get voting rights done. I don't know how it's any easier to get that done when you've got Republican control of the House and a bunch of GOP crazies who are setting their hair on fire every day. I don't know how you do that. So I think it's going to be difficult. I mean, maybe there's... I'll leave it there. I think it's just hard. Anybody else? Yeah. Here comes the tough one.
I mean, what do you think is least understood about this administration now that you've done all this reporting about them? What was most surprising to you, for instance?
That's a good question. I think the extent to which, you look at this White House from the outside and you see this duck that seems to be gliding smoothly across the surface most of the time, right? Except for Afghanistan and the documents thing. What I don't think I realized was all the furious paddling that's going on underneath, and the and the drama behind closed doors. Again, with Tony Blinken telling me one thing about Afghanistan and Bill Burns telling me another, and Mark Milley giving me a third version of the intelligence. And, you don't see that from the outside. That's what I like to think the book does, is give you a window into the fact that there's a lot more drama behind the scenes than we realize.
So how different is the Biden administration from other well-run administrations in terms of the processing and how it works?
Well,
or similar, different or similar?
Yeah. Compared to the previous regime administration, it's night and day. But I would say, look, there have been other well-run White Houses before, certainly. But I think that Joe Biden, nobody's ever stepped into that office with the kind of decades-long experience that Joe Biden had, and he saw all the great White House chiefs in action, and the not so great, and he knows how government works, and that's what his choice of Ron Klain revealed to me was. This is a guy who just knows, and it's not, as Mac and Jim would be the first to tell you, a lot of presidents just don't get that, don't understand how Washington works. Bill Clinton came in without much knowledge about how Washington worked, and Jimmy Carter was a total outsider. It took Jimmy Carter 3 years to figure out, that he needed a really empowered White House chief, and he finally got a good one in Jack Watson. It was too late. It was the last year of his administration. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's certainly one factor. Anybody else? Yeah, I'm happy to sign books. So where do you want me to do that?
Copies of Chris's book will be for sale up there as you check out.